Okay, good afternoon, dear participants. My name is Paula Ranne, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the very first webinar of ENQA, of the European Association for Quality Assurance in Higher Education. This is something that we have been planning to do for some time now. It's been a request from our membership mainly to gather colleagues around the same virtual table to discuss different topics. So we are happy to provide you with the very first webinar. We will be continuing this in the course of the spring also with a few other workshops that we will be informing you about. But let's get started. Today we are discussing the HAQAA Initiative, which is a project that ENQA has been partnering in for the past 3 years, a service contract between the European Union and the African Union Commission on the harmonization of quality assurance in higher education in Africa. We have 2 ladies today presenting, and I'm pleased to welcome first Ms. Elisabeth Colucci. She's currently a higher education expert specializing in internationalization, development cooperation, and regional integration processes. She's an advisor for the European University Association EUA and for the Global Observatory based in Barcelona. And she has led a number of global cooperation projects in higher education between Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And she has previously worked for EUA for 8 years, where she was a program manager responsible for internationalization in the higher education policy unit. And our second presenter is Mrs. Anneley Willemse, and she holds a master's in education, a bachelor honors, bachelor's degree, and a diploma in higher education. And she has completed an online course in quality assurance offered by the AAU, the African Association for African Universities, and she's currently busy in preparing a PhD degree. After having served the Namibian nation for 15 years as a high school teacher, she took up a position as a senior quality assurance officer at one of the quality assurance agencies in Namibia, the National Council for Higher Education, NCHE. And now, most recently, she has been involved in the HAQAA Initiative in the technical working group, which has prepared the African standards and guidelines that she will be presenting to us today. But now I would like to give the floor to Elisabeth. Before that, I still mention that all the participants, you're most welcome to type any questions as we go to the 2 presenters, or to us generally speaking. We take them up after the two presentations. And we will be also recording this session, and we will be posting the link on our website with the recorded session, so you are aware of that. But now I hand it over to Elisabeth for your presentation, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Paula, for the invitation and also for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to present the past 3 years. I think Anneley would confirm that we've made tremendous strides in cooperation with many partners across the African continent and also in Europe. My job today is to give you the overview of the HAQAA Initiative, what it intended to do, what it has done. And then I think Anneley will go into more detail on one of its main outputs, one of its main successes, which from our perspective are the African standards and guidelines for quality assurance, which in many ways reflect what we've done in Europe with the European standards and guidelines, but are their own product, their own distinct African product. So, but before we get into that, I would say a little bit on the initiative comprehensively. As Paula has said, HAQAA, I'm just trying to change, here we go, okay. HAQAA is a is a European Union funded initiative. It's a service contract. It's something that comes out of the Africa-EU Strategic Partnership, which is a strategic framework for African Union and European Union collaboration around a number of different political priorities. I think what's unique with this partnership is that the European Union is one of the few international donors or partners in the world that's interested in the African continental agenda. So Africa as a continent and African integration, and it supports the African Union to this effect. The objective of the HAQAA Initiative, when it was conceived, was to contribute to and support the harmonization of higher education programs and the creation of a revitalized, distinctive, attractive, and globally competitive African higher education space through enhanced intra-African collaboration. This is sort of the meta objective under which a number of different specific activities have been framed. Some of you might be familiar with what is called Tuning Africa, which is a European Union supportive initiative for getting curricularists together in different African countries to support collaboration on developing common learning outcomes for their study programs. So all of that falls into this basket. HAQAA specifically intended to develop a harmonized quality assurance and accreditation system at institutional level, national, regional, and Pan-African continental level. This is obviously very ambitious, and the reason that all 4 levels are mentioned, institutional, national, regional, and Pan-African, is because you will see in the African continent there are many different tracks when it comes to accreditation and harmonization, which are currently underway, whether they be at the institutional level, national, regional, economic community level, or Pan-African level. And somehow anything that's Pan-African has to utilize, capitalize different multi-speed initiatives. So ambitious, a service contract of 3 years. We've just concluded in December of last year with a successful conference in Dakar. And the European Commission has foreseen a new phase, which would probably start later this year and build upon what has already been developed. HAQAA mentioned, Paula mentioned that ENQA was a partner in the implementing consortium of this initiative. We also had on board the German Academic Exchange Service, which has been very active in supporting quality assurance in the African continent, particularly in East Africa traditionally, but also now in Western Africa. The EUA, the European University Association, which I previously worked for, and the Association of African Universities, which is sort of the African counterpart of the EUA. It's a continental body for university associations in Africa and universities. And interestingly enough, they had been named the quote unquote implementing organization of the African Union. So the African Union tries to implement its higher education agenda through the Association of African Universities, hence why the Association of African Universities was a critical partner in delivering this contract. I represented in this particular contract the University of Barcelona, which was sort of an intermediary, a coordinator of the partners, providing a management platform for the initiative. I think it's important just to briefly mention a few trends in Africa for quality assurance. I don't know in our audience how familiar you are with the continent. Certainly some of you are very familiar, others of you maybe not. Like I said before, it's multi-speeds. I think in general, quality assurance is responding to a very acute need, a need to revitalize African higher education, as you've seen in the previous slide, which comes from the African integration strategy, this particular word, revitalization. But also to deal with massification, which has been a tremendous pressure on higher education systems in Africa, the burgeoning private sector. Different countries have approached this in different ways, and some countries have not yet approached it at all or very little. And that's where you see the diversity in the African continent. You have some countries that have national QA agencies, even fairly autonomous ones, to some extent, that have been active for over a decade and are currently seeking to adapt, improve, and consolidate their QA system. We've seen examples, for example, in a massive university sector in Nigeria. We can look at the example of Egypt. You have a number of agencies that have been created in Eastern Africa now, and South Africa, which has a longer legacy of regulation and also quality assurance enhancement. And then you have other countries that simply don't have a national quality assurance system, but are planning very much to develop one and are in the process of setting up potentially an agency. We saw a lot of countries with this interest in the HAQAA Initiative, but it's incipient. It's very incipient, and most, not exclusively, but many countries in Francophone Africa are in this situation as of present. You have a number of regional bodies and regulators, which are very important. These might be at the level of associations or networks, but also at the levels of regional economic communities and bodies that have a particular mandate in the higher education sector, such as in Eastern Africa with the Eastern African Economic Community, SADC in Southern Africa, the South African Regional Development Community, etc., etc. And here on the slide, I've listed a few of those bodies that are particularly influential at the level of higher education. The IUCEA, which is the East Inter-University Council for East Africa, has been extremely active over the past decade and a half, was supported by the German Academic Exchange Service to develop a quality assurance framework and system for Eastern Africa, which has had a huge impact. Spin-off network called the ENQA, which is essentially a network of quality assurance professionals, which is very active in Eastern Africa, etc. You have versioning initiatives in SADC. The SAQAN, SAQAM, is a new network of quality assurance agencies in SADC, in the Southern African region, with similar ambitions, I would say, to the IUCEA and the EAQAN. I'm saying a lot of acronyms. There are many acronyms. This is part of the joy of working in the diverse African continent, but somehow you get used to them. So basically, just to illustrate a little bit the diversity, you have regional dynamics, you have linguistic community dynamics, you have some countries that are more advanced, some countries less, and all of this we somehow had to frame within this continental objective of the African Union for harmonized and comparable QA systems. Just again, the political backbone of this comes from the African Union's Continental Strategy for Education, the CESA, and this is an important reference document. And more specifically, it comes from a framework that was endorsed by the African Union in 2015 called the Pan-African Quality Assurance and Accreditation Framework, the PAQAF, as we like to say in short, or PAQAF, I say PAQAF. And this framework is something that was endorsed at the same time the HAQAA Initiative was launched. The European Union had intended to fund a number of actions that would support the realization of this framework and of its various action lines. When this framework was launched, many of what it proposed had not yet been developed, so it was an ambition. And what we've done under HAQAA is effectively to help to deliver upon this particular framework. It was challenging because many stakeholders in Africa at the time were not familiar with it, or maybe had been consulted but didn't quite understand it. So we came basically as a consortium trying to promote a dialogue about this Pan-African framework to many institutions and stakeholders for whom it was very new. And so there was a lot of sensitization about the importance of African continental harmonization that had to be done. The action lines of the PAQAF are the following that you see on the slide. The ones in red are the ones that we have effectively addressed under HAQAA. The one in blue is something that the tuning initiative, which I mentioned previously, is proposing. There's been a study that's proposed how to develop an African credit transfer system. And the things that are still in black remain to be developed. For example, the development of an African continental qualifications framework, and also the development of a register for QA agencies, potentially comparable to the ACAR, what we have in Europe, though to be seen. There's also something interesting that will be, I think, highly debated in the next years because it is high on the African Union agenda, and that is the creation of a continental agency that would somehow oversee the PACWAF and all of its action lines and all of its tools. It would oversee the promotion of the African standards and guidelines. It would oversee the utilization of the African credit transfer system, etc. This is a work in progress, and there was a consultation event in December in Addis Ababa, where the African Union has its headquarters, where this was debated. And I think in the next phase of HAQAA, you will probably see this issue, this continental agency, being discussed more, the feasibility of it, how it should be set up, how it should operate, etc., etc. Okay, just to move forward. So as I said, we had in HAQAA a number of activities that we developed that were very much about delivering upon this PACWAF framework. First and foremost, we developed tools for the PACWAF. We actually proposed African standards and guidelines for quality assurance, and Anneley will tell you in much more depth how that was done. Second of all, we contributed to developing a quote-unquote common language for quality assurance in Africa. As I said before, you have many different systems developing at different speeds, regional dynamics, linguistic dynamics. So our job was to put together a continental level training course where we could break down the notion of quality and quality assurance in Africa and explore across linguistic and cultural and regional community lines what that actually meant. And then third, we also provided some support for institutional tremendous need across the African continent to support institutions, higher education institutions, to understand quality and to develop their own quality assurance processes. This is something we know very well in Europe. It's something we had been living for almost 2 decades now. And very much the needs are mirrored in Africa and of course in other parts of the world. The African Union has proposed a quality assessment tool that is supposed to be very African in its nature and is supposed to help African universities reflect on their quality and their quality assurance processes. And this tool was promoted in the HAQAA Initiative via a series of institutional evaluations, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Just to give you a little bit of information on each of those 3 areas that I just put forward to you. The HAQAA training course, I think, was unique in many ways. It was the first time a training course brought together representatives of the entire African continent. In the African Union, you have 5 regions, 5 sub-regions, including Northern Africa, where Arabic is spoken and where the cooperation dynamics and priorities are potentially different than in some sub-Saharan African regions. You also, of course, you have the entire Francophone Africa. You have Lusophone Africa via Angola, Mozambique, and Cabo Verde. You have Anglophone Africa. So from a linguistic perspective, bringing all these countries together in itself is difficult, but also from the tradition of their higher education systems, which is very much linked to different colonial influences on the continent. But we brought them all together. We had the ministries endorse and nominate a representative. In many cases, someone from the quality assurance agency or from the ministry, but in some cases, someone coming from an institution who had been somehow charged with the development of the quality assurance system in their country. So that created an interesting dynamic because you had both institutional and national regulatory body perspectives in the training group. We also included some African associations that are very much essential to the African QA agenda in this group. And the training course was over the course of about a year and a half. We had presence or physical activities, seminars, etc. We had The participants draw up personal action plans for specific activities or plans or projects they wanted to take forward in their own countries and systems. And we did a lot of reflecting on the Pan-African Quality Assurance and Accreditation Framework. As I had mentioned before, this was a very new concept for many. Here you see more or less the content of what we put forward. We started with the European example, and it's true that this is a European Union funded initiative, and with a reason, I think, and you see we have many European institutions in the partnership, the implementing consortium, the DAD, ENQA, EUA, and for us it was important to share the European experience in quality assurance under the Bologna process in the European higher education area, to discuss the tools we've developed for quality assurance, to discuss the bodies. Again, all in the spirit of sharing and knowledge exchange. I think it was very important in this particular type of initiative that the African stakeholders develop their own version of harmonization and integration. Our job was simply to share the European experience, what's worked, what has not, how the process has developed from a European standpoint. We then went on to discussing the African tools, the African framework, and to create a lot of discussion around the African standards and guidelines for quality assurance as they were being developed. In fact, we even used this group to consult to some extent on that document, the African standards and guidelines. As I mentioned, we had personal action plans. And you see here how that broke down a little bit. We did see some trends in what the different participants expressed as needs for their particular countries or systems. A number of countries were interested in establishing a national quality assurance agency. A personal action plan revolved around that. Here you see examples from Mali, Niger, Chad. There were 10 countries that were interested in that. Some countries were interested in further developing institutional and program evaluation and sensitizing universities to this process. You see Gabon and Algeria had expressed interest in this. Capacity building for quality assurance agencies, so developing capacity of QA agency staff was expressed by Egypt. We had one regional project. This was interesting. The countries of the SADC region of Southern Africa got together and they wanted to work very much on developing a proposal for a credit system for the Southern African region, et cetera, et cetera. I think it was fairly interesting, this exercise. There were certainly groupings of countries. We tried to facilitate dialogue across a forum, but there I think we confronted linguistic barriers. That said, all of the participants concurred that it was particularly interesting to have a continental level training initiative, that this was perhaps the first time that they had come in contact with quality assurance experts and officials from other regions in Africa, and that they had quite a lot in common. We had some participants that said that they would very much like to invite other African experts from other African systems to their countries to participate in national training activities for the university sector, for example. We had a number of participants that volunteered to serve as ambassadors in the future for the Pan-African Quality Assurance and Accreditation Framework, to spread knowledge about it in their particular systems. And this is something that certainly has to be capitalized on, I think, in the next HAQAA phase. There were some messages that we took away from this training course, which I've put here on the slide. Some of them seem quite obvious. For example, that external quality assurance should strengthen internal quality assurance. This is, I think, from a European perspective, is something we would all embrace, but it was something that had to be put forward, I think, for a number of African countries, and this was an important thing to reiterate, and it became an underlying premise of the African standards and guidelines as well. Another takeaway was that the participants felt strongly that the African standards and guidelines could help to create a common understanding of quality assurance on the continent. And they could also serve as a reference point for a number of countries that are just developing their QA agencies and systems, and that this was a tremendous opportunity. I mentioned previously that HAQAA also had a provision for supporting institutional quality assurance. This is a massive feat. There are thousands of higher education institutions on the continent that have needs. So we had to be pragmatic with this. We had a request from the African Union to conduct a series of institutional evaluations using what is called the AQRM, which is the African Quality Rating Mechanism, the AQRM. This is an officially endorsed institutional assessment tool of the African Union. It is part of the HAQAA framework, and it was developed to reflect, to a large extent, African needs. And we were asked to select a sample of universities representing different African regions, but also different capacities and missions in order to apply this tool. It had already been piloted on African universities in a previous phase by the African Union, and we basically continued it and furthered it under HAQAA. Again, a very interesting exercise. I think probably the most important aspect of this exercise was not the survey itself, though the survey, of course, provided an important basis for universities to look at their own data collection systems internally and things like this, but it was in fact the visits that were conducted. So basically, the African universities that participated filled in the African Quality Rating Mechanism, and if you're interested in this tool, you can find more details about it on the website of the AAU and also on the HAQAA Initiative website. You can see, what are the different standards and parameters that are assessed in this tool. Universities fill it out, and then an expert team came in. We selected African European expert teams. So each expert team had potentially 2 European quality assessors and 1 African. And they went in and they validated essentially the results, but it was an opportunity for the universities to exchange with external expertise, to receive feedback, etc. Reports of these evaluations were made public. This was an important requirement for participating in this exercise, and you can find them on the HAQAA website. There, just in case you're interested, quickly you see the 15 institutions that participated, and what's interesting here is that we had 4 private institutions and also 1 ODL, so 1 open university, the Zimbabwe Open University. So the idea was really to see if this tool, the AQRM, could meet the needs of very diverse universities in the African continent. Supporting external quality assurance, and I won't go too much into detail here because I think Anneley will also pick up on this, but from the African Standards and Guidelines, we tasked our technical working group, which actually created all of this, to develop a review methodology for quality assurance agencies. And then this was subsequently piloted. This is an exercise we've just concluded, we're still receiving reports. But it was, I think, a first initiative to create awareness for the need for quality assurance agencies in Africa to also be accountable and also to undergo evaluation. We realized that it would be premature to assume that all African countries could have an agency evaluated potentially, because many do not. So we offered this in sort of a 2-track approach. We offered agency reviews to countries that had established agencies, and we offered what we called consultancy visits to countries that do not yet have agencies, or perhaps have a very young agency and would like support and consultancy in developing their QA agency or their QA system. And there you see the countries that participated. A very formative exercise. We're generating feedback on the agency review methodology from this exercise, and I think there is a huge will to continue this in the next phase of HAQAA. I will finish now. I had just a few reflections on these past 3 years of the HAQAA initiative and what that's taught us. I think it has been a major impulse for developing the various action lines of the PAQUAF, of the political framework of the African Union, in cooperation between African, regional, and national stakeholder organizations, and of course with some European support and input. It's created a forum for generating debate and understanding regarding continental objectives in Africa, and also to promote the AU policy agenda. And it's created stronger links across regions within Africa and across different language groups around the topic of quality and quality assurance. Though clearly much work has to be done. It's a tremendously huge continent with a high number of stakeholders. And we've had to be modestly ambitious, I think, with this particular contract. What's clear is that there's no one size fits all for Africa, but I think for anywhere in the world. The different regional contexts and different stages of development really need to be considered, whether it be in a training program, whether it be in institutional evaluations or what have you. Regional and national partners play a critical role, and we also need to find synergies. There's a lot of, not competing initiatives, but a lot of initiatives that happen sometimes in parallel. UNESCO, for example, is supporting quality assurance agency development in a number of countries. You have the World Bank supporting African Centers of Excellence, which has a strong quality assurance and accreditation dynamic involved. You have the Agence Universitaire de la Francophonie, the AUF, also involved to a large extent in quality assurance activities in Francophone Africa. So you have a lot of different initiatives just in this little microfield. And I think synergies are critical. We had an advisory board of key stakeholders across the continent, which met frequently. And this became a really important forum for exchange on what was actually happening in Africa and where we could seek synergies. Exchange and dialogue between both higher education institutions and agencies and regulatory bodies is critical, and I think any training program has to entail that component going forward. And finally, and I think this is again a lesson that we learned in Europe and are still learning, change is slow, both at the institutional level and at the policy level, and it needs a long-term financial investment, and this can't just come from the European Union. The European Union is providing a support, but this really needs to come from African governments and systems. That's what I have to say. I leave you with the website of the HAQAA Initiative. It's still a work in progress. We're still posting some reports there. You'll find annotations from the initiative, a summary report of the AQRM exercise. For example, we'll be translating further sections of it into French. So, but there you have it, and also some contact details. And I welcome any questions in the forum now, and of course, would hand over to Anneley, who will give you more insight and more depth, in particular on the African standards and guidelines.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for summarizing so concisely our 3-year journey in the HAQAA Initiative, and also providing us insights to the more general development in the African higher education landscape. I'm encouraging all participants to write any questions to Elizabeth in your chat boxes. We will collect those questions and we'll take those at the end of the seminar. Elizabeth will stay with us also till the end. And now I hand over to Anneley, who will discuss in more detail the African standards and guidelines.
Good afternoon, participants. Paula, thank you very much. And Elizabeth also, thank you very much for that elaborative background. So at least you have made my task now. You have made my task easier. I will right away jump into my presentation, taking you through the African standards and guidelines. Basically, what the ASG-QA are is a set of non-prescriptive but flexible standards and guidelines for internal and external quality assurance in higher education in Africa. I'm very happy that we here in Africa are now following the example that Europe is setting for us in the Bologna process, so that we can also come up with a common requirements for quality assurance in higher education. The ASG also provides an overarching framework for quality assurance in higher education in Africa. The standards are stated as common minimum requirements, really just giving the institutions, the higher education institutions, and the quality assurance agencies a insight in what they require in order to improve the quality that they offer to their students and their stakeholders. The guidelines, again, are more specific and really broad in order to guide the institutions and the agencies on the best way to address each standard and allow for the collection of evidence in support of their status of quality. Now, the guidelines really are going into detail in order to guide the institutions and the agencies to say you have to have this in place, these policies, these systems, in order to meet the requirements or to comply. Then the standards and guidelines are also an example of good practice that we here in Africa want to follow in order to be on the kind of the same page, sort of. And also it is a mechanism for quality enhancement in African higher education institutions and quality assurance agencies. They are not exhaustive, meaning that if any particular higher education institution or agency want to add additional standards to suit their context, then they are really free to do so. We have, like Elizabeth has said, we have used the ESG of the 2015 edition, and I think the latest also, we have used to benchmark what we have developed, the ASG-QA, but of course, we have contextualized the standards and guidelines to be fit for the African higher education landscape. Now, I'm so proud when I'm looking at this cover page because it means that our hard work of about 2 years have eventually came to a realization where we can actually access the document via this link. And it was launched in December 2018 and are also available in the 4 languages of the African Union, which is English, French, Portuguese, and Arabic. And I must say that a lot of work really went into this, translating the ASG, the guidelines and the standards, so that it can suit the context of each and every country and institution. Now, the purpose of our guidelines is to support higher education institutions and our quality assurance agencies in implementing good quality assurance practices by helping them to develop adequate internal quality assurance mechanisms for those that don't have them in place yet. And then also that fit international good practice, and also to assist them to assess their own quality through self-assessment. Some of our institutions here in Africa don't have internal quality assurance systems, and that is why we are so happy that we could be fortunate really to come up with this document in order to assist our institution and also our agencies. In particular, the ASG-QA is aimed at supporting higher education institutions and quality assurance agencies to have a common framework and understanding of quality assurance among stakeholders at continental level, regional level, and at the national level. It's also there to develop mutual trust in order to recognize qualifications wherever our students are moving within the higher education space in Africa, and also human resources in Africa, like staff exchanges and so forth. Also, we have developed the guidelines to ensure quality improvement through self-assessment, external peer reviews, and continuous monitoring and evaluation. Because we really, here in Africa, are striving for the best. We also want to be the best, and we also want to give the best to our students and our stakeholders. Also, the standards and guidelines are there to promote transparency and accountability by providing appropriate information on quality assurance to the public. Quality assurance in higher education is quite new in Africa for certain regions or sub-regions, like the Southern African region where we are based. We really have to do more. But as Elizabeth has also mentioned, we have also developed our regional national network that is known as SAQAA, Southern African Quality Assurance Network. It's also to promote a sustainable quality culture in higher education institutions, alongside the African quality rating mechanism that Elizabeth also alluded to, helping the institutions to implement relevant teaching and learning resources, as well as student assessment mechanisms. Also to promote international competitiveness of Africa's higher education system, so that wherever our students are going in the world, the qualifications that they have obtained at our higher education institutions should be recognized. The principles and methodologies that we have used to develop the standards and guidelines. First of all, we are on the premise, or we believe that the higher education institutions should be the custodians of their own quality. So they should really try to develop internal quality assurance systems in line with the national quality assurance system, if there is one in a particular country. We have heard from Elizabeth that some of our countries are in the process of developing national systems, and even at our higher education institutions, some are busy to come up with quality assurance units in the institution. Also, the autonomy, identity, and integrity of higher education institutions are acknowledged and respected. So what the institutions are doing internally in order to improve quality, we need to also acknowledge and we need to respect that. The methodologies that we have used to develop the standards and guidelines, I think Elizabeth also alluded to this. First of all, we really went into a very deep and wide consultation with stakeholders in order to have everyone on board and in order to have everyone's voice heard in the development of these standards and guidelines. We have compared and we have gathered the standards and guidelines of higher education already in use in Africa, so that we could not leave out any country or any institution or quality assurance body that already has a system in place. And we have found a lot of similarities when we compared these systems. We have also consulted regional quality assurance networks or associations, like the IUCEA, Inter-University Council of East Africa, the Arab Network for Quality Assurance in Higher Education, and the African and Malagasy Council for Higher Education in Francophone. And then, of course, I've already also said that we have benchmarked our African standards and guidelines with the European standards and guidelines developed well before we have started thinking of doing this. And I also just want to really say thank you to the EU, who is really also supporting quality assurance initiatives in Namibia, in Africa, I mean, and we really appreciate that and we value it a lot. The scope, now the standards and guidelines apply to all types of higher education institutions, and of course also the quality assurance agencies, whether it's driven by the government or whether it's private ones. Irrespective of the mode of study or place of delivery, including transnational and cross-border delivery. It always referred to both undergraduate and postgraduate students unless otherwise stated. It includes all staff, academic, research, administrative, and technical or support staff unless otherwise stated. It should also apply, it should be applied taking into account existing qualifications frameworks and credit accumulation and transfer systems in operation in the continent, because we have quite a few of them, a number of them in Africa. Now the ASG-QA are divided into three parts. We have part A, internal quality assurance of higher education institutions, part B, external quality assurance done or conducted by the agencies when they go out to the institutions to do program accreditation or institutional audits. And then part C, internal quality assurance for quality assurance agencies. I must say that this is a first for Africa, because we never had standards and guidelines to check the watchdog, as they say, the watchdog are now being checked. So we are so grateful that we also have this in place now in order to also improve the standard of our quality assurance agencies. We have put this, the interlinkage in a schematic presentation, just to give to a better understanding to our the users of these standards and guidelines. So as you can see, part A is for internal quality assurance used by the institutions to assure their own quality and also when they do self-evaluation for quality enhancement. Part B is for external use used by quality assurance agencies when they conduct institutional audits or program accreditation at higher education institutions. And then, of course, we have part C, used by the quality assurance agencies internally to assure their own quality, improve their own quality, and then when doing self-evaluation in preparation of an external review. Part A, as I've said, is intended for the internal quality assurance at the level of higher education institutions. And what is so good for us with Part A is that it also incorporates standards and guidelines for open and distance learning modes. And many of our systems, our national systems in Africa also lack this part. And we are so grateful that we could include it in the internal quality assurance of institutions. Part A covers areas that are considered essential for the attainment of the provision of quality higher education and focuses mainly on institutional governance, policies and processes that promote quality higher education, teaching and learning environment, research and innovation, collaboration and community engagement. And here the focus really is on the key pillars of higher education. Part B is intended for external quality assurance of higher education institutions conducted by the quality assurance agencies. And they take into account the standards and guidelines in Part A, which higher education institutions are using to improve their quality, ensuring that internal quality assurance examined is relevant to and efficient for the concerned higher education institution. So Part B covers objectives of external quality assurance, designing mechanisms that are fit for purpose, independence, decisions and reporting, periodic review, and complaints and appeals. You must please excuse me if I'm going a bit fast. I'm just checking the time, and I have 3 minutes left. Part C, as we have said, is intended for internal quality assurance for quality assurance agencies. And for them, when they are doing their self-assessment, when they write their self-assessment report, and also have to evaluate now how they are doing in terms of the policies and practices, procedures, and activities that they are implementing in their institutions itself. And then also for external assessment or evaluation by another body or peer organization. Part C covers policies, processes, and activities of the quality assurance agency, legal status, vision and mission, financial and human resources, independence of the agency, and then standards and processes used by the quality assurance agency to improve quality in the institution and to improve their own quality. Excuse me for that. Just a summary of the standards and in Part A, we have 13 standards. And we initially had, I think, 21 or 22, but after discussions and consultations, we came up with these final ones. So, as I've said, vision, mission, and strategic objectives is number 1. Number 2, governance and management, human resources, financial resource management, infrastructure and facilities, student recruitment, admission, certification, and support services. Really, it's just to ensure that the institutions have all these systems and policies for recruitment in place, the correct or the right facilities and infrastructure in order to offer certain programs. Teaching, learning, and assessment is another standard. Also, the design, approval, monitoring, and evaluation of study programs, research and innovation, community engagement, information management system, public communication. Do they share what they are doing with the public? Is it legitimate? Is the information correct, and so forth? and then collaboration, staff, and student mobility. Then just quickly to summarize part B, the standards, there are 7. And the first one is objectives of external quality assurance and consideration for internal quality assurance. B2, designing external quality assurance mechanisms fit for purpose. Implementation processes of external quality assurance. So when the agency are going out to the institutions to conduct a review, do they have proper systems in place, and independence of evaluation, decision and reporting of external quality assurance outcomes. Do they report what they have found in the institutions during reviews or accreditation exercises, and do they publish these reports? Periodic review of institutions and programs. How regular is this quality assurance agency going out to the institutions to do program accreditation or to audit the institution? And then complaints and appeals. This is also a standard that's really lacking in our system and something that we need to work on. But see, we have 9 standards. Legal status of the agency. Is there an act in place in order to guide the operations of the agency? Vision and mission statement, are they published? Do the staff know the vision and the mission? The governance and management, are there proper structures in place to manage the activities of the agency? Independence of quality assurance of the quality assurance agency. Policies, processes, and activities. Do they have proper systems in place to go out there and to assess their own quality? Internal quality assurance of the agency. How do they ensure that what they are doing internally in the organization is really of quality and the right standards? Financial and human resources. Do they appoint the right people? Are they experienced? Are they qualified? And benchmarking, networking, and collaboration. Do they go out? Do they attend conferences? Do they link up with other organizations, with peer organizations, and do they share what they are doing in order to improve also their own activities? And then periodic reviews of the quality assurance agency. The implementation and ownership of the ASG-QA. We say that the national quality assurance agencies are expected to advocate the ASG-QA to ensure implementation thereof. The ASG will also serve as the guiding framework in facilitating the establishment of quality assurance agencies in countries where do not exist, like Elizabeth said, and also ensure good practices in existing quality assurance agencies. And with 37 countries in Africa have quality assurance agencies. And then the effective implementation of parts B and C of the ASG-QA necessitated the development of review methodology. And for the sake of time, I think I will not go into this because Elizabeth also really shared this with the participants. And yeah, and I think then on that note, I thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Anneley, for your very thorough presentation on the African Standards and Guidelines. I would now just pick those 2 questions that we have received during your presentations. Merci beaucoup pour vos questions. I will respond in English this time for all the participants also. The first question is concerning whether the African Standards and Guidelines are designed specifically for higher education institutions or academic institutions and so, or is it also for organizations, Pan-African organizations that offer training such as the African Local Governments Academy? I would say that the African Standards and Guidelines are written first to higher education institutions, how to set up an internal quality assurance system, how it should and could look like, how it could be continuously developed and kept maintained and kept up and up to date with the developments in the institution. And it also provides sort of the methodology for quality assurance agencies that carry out accreditation or audit at higher education institutions to make sure that institutions' internal quality assurance systems are fit for purpose and transparent and existing, first of all, of course. So in that sense, they are not directly maybe written to other contexts, but I would still say you can be inspired by the good practices that have been laid out in the African Standards and Guidelines, regardless of the context of your own organization. So I welcome you to access those documents in your own language and see whether you can find some synergies. And perhaps your organizations have those direct links to the higher education sector and the quality assurance agencies in your countries. Anneley or Elizabeth, you have anything to add? Would you agree with me?
No, I think I agree with you, Paula. So I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Yeah, as well, I agree. I think it's important to reiterate that we have the African Standards and Guidelines in 4 languages, the 4 official languages of the African Union, including French. I see that the question has come in French, and in Arabic. And a special thanks goes to our Egyptian colleagues who translated that for us so diligently. One other point is that, and I think this is very important, the African Standards and Guidelines are totally voluntary. This is a document now that can be used by anyone or any institution that finds them useful and inspirational. They are by no means a document that's intended to inspire regulation in the African continent at this point in time, though certainly the African Union is promoting very much their uptake and wants very much the regulatory bodies that do exist or are being developed to use them. But at this point, this is a voluntary document.
Yes, and at the same time, it emphasizes the higher education institutions and also the quality assurance agencies' responsibility towards their stakeholders. So also in that respect, I encourage you to see what is in there that might relate to the relationship of, let's say, higher education institutions and your organization when it comes to quality assurance and related activities. We have a second question, whether we will be sharing these presentations. Yes, we will put them online, so you are most welcome to share them with your colleagues, and hopefully they will be of use to them. So we will do that. A third question, will the different African countries at this stage impose the ASG as a regulatory framework or tool, or will this depend on the status of their quality assurance systems? I think Elizabeth partly already answered this question. For the time being, as in Europe, to some extent, it's a voluntary document. What we are expecting is an endorsement by the heads of state in Africa during 2019, and whether that will sort of strengthen the role of the document as an official framework document. I think that is something we are expecting. Elizabeth, do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, at the next African Union summit, this in theory, according to our colleagues in the African Union, the African Standards and Guidelines would be tabled for endorsement. It's expected that they would be endorsed. What that then means in terms of practice is difficult to say. I mean, it certainly generates more political backing for the African Standards and Guidelines, and the idea is that national systems that are creating or revising or reforming their QA regulatory bodies would somehow try to utilize them. That is the idea.
Mm-hmm. In the meantime, I think we have a final question coming up. Somebody is typing. Here it is. No, just a second. In the meantime, because we're soon wrapping up the webinar, I would like to tell you that We expect to organize the next webinar around April, possibly on some subject-specific approach on quality assurance. We will be sending around a feedback survey after this webinar, so please feel free to suggest topics also for ENQA webinars in the future. So we will investigate what is in your interests to organize in the coming months. So please make sure you follow us on the social media and newsletter, perhaps, to be updated on the upcoming webinars. We have a comment. Congratulations on this new framework. Thank you very much. I say thank you on behalf of also the technical working group, as I was working closely with them and coordinating that working group. It has a different flavor than the European Standards and Guidelines, definitely. Please take a look. It will be interesting to see if our experiences will help in the next version of the European Standards and Guidelines. Yes. That is, I think, Siggy from Iceland. Thank you very much for your comment. And I think it's time for us to actually wrap up the webinar. Thank you for taking this time on this Monday afternoon to come and discuss with us and hear about the developments in the African higher education and quality assurance landscape. Our apologies for the minor clumsiness at the beginning of this very first ENQA webinar in the history. I think it has gone pretty well. We are happy to see that everybody sort of joined throughout from the beginning till the end, no dropouts. And we would really appreciate your feedback on this webinar. And I thank you warmly, presenters, dear ladies, for joining me this afternoon. That's about it. See you next time and have a good week.